Hi, I'm Jim Ross. I'm a former PCA, a former PCA surrogate, and a father of a couple of kids who have disabilities themselves. I've been involved in the PCA program for a long time, since it started in the 1970s. And that was a time when Massachusetts was making a lot of efforts to make sure that people with disabilities had a lot of control over their lives. And this control is a cornerstone of the PCA program in Massachusetts. In order for us to do our work as PCAs most effectively, I think it's really important that we understand the history. And the history of the PCA program is embedded in some very important movements in Massachusetts and the nation. The deinstitutionalization movement, the civil rights movement for sure, and of course the independent living movement. And there's no way in a short segment like this that we can do justice to the rich and deep history of the PCA program in its entirety, but we'd certainly like to give you folks a start. Prior to the World Wars, many people with disabilities lived short and dismal lives. Many of them lived in institutions. Right here in Massachusetts, for instance, the oldest institution in the Western Hemisphere, Fernald State School, was founded in 1848. During the World War, medical advances were rapid. At the end of World War II in 1946, many soldiers who would have previously died returned to the United States. These battlefield medical advancements were expanded upon back in the United States and were used to save the lives of many people with disabilities and chronic illnesses. But oftentimes, these folks back in the United States were forced then to live in institutions, nursing homes, and other sorts of facilities. But many of these people with disabilities began to resent the fact that they were kept out of the community, out of jobs, out of schools. And so they took a page from the civil rights movement, from people of color, and they began to advocate very strongly and stand up for themselves. Interestingly, many of the early programs that set the stage for people with disabilities to be more in control of their lives came not from disability-specific programs, but from programs for the poor. One of our great social injustices was that the way we treated people with disabilities forced many of them, and oftentimes their families, into lives of poverty. Between 1964 and 1974, some of the critical programs for the poor that were established included the food stamp program, Medicaid and Medicare for all kinds of medical services, and the Section 8 housing subsidy program. There were, of course, programs that were developed specifically for people with disabilities. The SSDI and SSI programs through the Social Security Administration provided some basic financial income for people. Section 504 of the Rehab Act protected people with disabilities against discrimination in the workplace. And the Education for All Handicapped Children Act made sure that kids with disabilities had free public education. Because all of these programs increased the opportunities for people with disabilities to access education, income, health care, and housing, the chances for independence in the community were greatly increased. This included, in 1963, many people being able to move out of institutions. In the 1970s, Centers for Independent Living were established, primarily by people with physical disabilities. Consumer control was, and remains to this day, the cornerstone of the centers. The Mass Health PCA program began in 1976 through some of the Centers for Independent Living. It was initially established for PCA users who could self-direct and needed hands-on help. For 12 years, the PCA program did not allow people with disabilities to participate whose disability excluded them from being able to self-direct. This included lots of people, including people with brain injuries, dementia, intellectual and developmental disabilities, and other disabilities as well. Some of those disability groups who had been excluded from the PCA program because they could not self-direct began to push for inclusion. This was upsetting to some of the other PCA users who thought that this was going to be an attack on consumer control. In 1988, the PCA program expanded to include a surrogacy model. This model let people who could not fully self-direct have a volunteer to help them manage those portions of the PCA program that they could not handle themselves. The availability of the surrogacy model prompted great growth in the PCA program. In fact, today, more than half of PCA users use the PCA surrogacy model. Initially, PCAs were paid directly by their PCA consumer from funds that they received from Mass Health. However, there were a lot of problems that developed, and there were complaints around workers' compensation and taxes and other related items like that. The fiscal intermediary was introduced to the PCA system to provide some financial controls to the program. The addition of the fiscal intermediary prompted further growth in the Mass Health PCA system. In 2006, the Massachusetts PCA Workforce Council was established. This was done in preparation for unionization by the PCAs. This caused a lot of concern to people in the PCA program who were worried that unionizing the PCAs would infringe on consumer control. Despite concerns from many PCA users, in 2007, PCAs did unionize. The PCAs are not allowed to strike. In 2013, OneCare passes, and this really clarified some of the issues around health care for people who receive both Mass Health and Medicare. One of the provisions in OneCare was that people who needed cueing or prompting would be able to access the Massachusetts PCA program. For 38 years, any training that was received by PCAs was given to them by their PCA employer or sometimes by the surrogate. But one of the more recent developments in the PCA program in Massachusetts is a new hire orientation, so that now all PCAs who are new to the PCA system are required to have a 3-hour orientation. In an effort to continue to protect consumer control, it is clearly recognized that this 3-hour orientation is in no way meant to replace the training that is provided by the PCA consumer and sometimes the surrogate. I encourage all of you to find out more about the PCA system's history and the independent living movement. There's a lot of stuff that was not covered in this short video today. Also, you folks are part of the developing PCA program. Keep your eyes open for other changes that are coming along.